You love her voice, you love her looks. What Melissa loves are comic books. Hi, everybody, welcome back. So, we have talked 1937 to death, and I am actually all done. So, we're doing a wrap up video now, as I've done for 35 and 36, where we go over talking about that year, and maybe we'll learn a few new things about it too. So, let's see what my notes say. In 1937, nylon was patented. The electric clothes dryer was patented. The world's first jet engine was tested. Spam the food was first introduced. New companies founded this year included Air Canada, Dunham Sports, Krispy Kreme, MGM's Cartoon Division, Pepperidge Farms, because Pepperidge Farms remembers, Polaroid, Progressive Mutual Insurance, and Volkswagen. By the end of 1937, there were 7 comic book publishers: David McKay, Dell, National, Ultem, formerly Comics Magazine, Eastern Color, United Features, and newcomer to the game, Comic Favorites. Of them, 4.5 of them were focused on publishing comic strip reprints. And that's in the United States, the focus of this channel. But UK publishers are beginning to take an interest in this thing called comic books too, but their comic books will initially be more like magazines. In Belgium, the comic strip The Adventures of Tintin is packaged into its 6th volume, sold as books instead of comic books as we know them. Europe could have used more entertainment of this sort, more so than us, because Europe was trapped between 2 deadly forces, communism and nationalism. The Catholic Church denounced both of these isms this year. In the West, nationalism was on the brink of taking total control of Spain. Franco's nationalist forces had taken the whole country save for the capital, Madrid, which survived a long siege, though tens of thousands of Spaniards will die on both sides before it's over. The Republicans, the good guys back then, at least in that country, fought to preserve liberty, while the nationalists were fascists who wanted Franco to have unlimited power. Speaking of fascism, Nazism is its own form of nationalism with a particularly vicious strain of racism, and that had not only taken control of Germany as early as 1933, but was experimenting with forming alliances in other countries. The League of Nations had declared that no other nations could intervene in Spain's civil war, but Nazi Germany just did whatever they felt like, and they were assisting Franco in Spain. The Germans bombed Guernica for Franco, as immortalized in the work of a young Pablo Picasso. Communism was supposed to work for everyone, but it was a system of governance that proved easily corruptible, and produced a dictator in Joseph Stalin, even more monstrous than Hitler and Franco. 1937 saw the beginning of Stalin's Great Purge, where up to 750,000 dissenting voices were executed, and 1 million more suspected of thinking about dissenting were put into labor camps. This is what can happen when a dictator is not deposed quickly enough. Protesting and dissenting alone are not enough to stop a dictator willing to commit any crime to stay in power. Now, the United States shrugged at all this and went about its business. The activities of Nazi Germany were concerning, but not enough to stop doing business with them, like air travel on the famous Hindenburg Zeppelin. 1937 was the start of the Hindenburg's 2nd season of intercontinental flights, and it was on its 11th visit to the United States when, in hindsight, it became clear that hydrogen gas was a very dangerous method to make Zeppelins float. Isolated from all this carnage abroad, the United States had nothing more pressing to deal with than the continuing Great Depression. The economy had been very slowly recovering since 1933, but in 1937, another recession happened, undoing a lot of that recovery. The GDP fell 10% and unemployment rose to 20%. Industrial production fell 32%. That the comic book industry was able to grow during this time speaks volumes of the public's appetite for comic books. For the first time in this history I'm telling, we have some sales data to go on from 1937. David McKay's Ace Comics was selling on average 223,000 copies per issue. Eastern Color's Famous Funnies was doing even better, averaging 435,000 per issue. We know what the monthly breakdown of sales was for Famous Funnies thanks to their postal statements preserved on the website Comicron. Feel free to examine that after you're done watching this. And there are two big takeaways from all this data. One is that sales were already great compared to comic book sales today. And the second is that Eastern Color's Famous Funnies' monthly sales remain relatively steady through the end of the year, which is interesting because a few months earlier, Comics Favorites Feature Funnies had just poached their best features. Now let's expand on those 2 points. That second point means that content was not the chief driver of comic book sales, but must have been some other factor, likely distribution. There was a large audience eager for this product if they could just get it. And the ones who reaped the benefit of those sales had the best system for getting their product in front of the most people. And back to the first point about sales then compared to comic book sales today, today's publishers would, and excuse me for this, orgasm in their pants if they suddenly started selling 435,000 copies a month of a title. Absolute Batman #1 sold almost 400,000 copies last year, and that was considered a record-breaking success. So why did the comic book industry of 1937 keep acting like a flailing industry desperate for breakout success? This might be explained by what they saw themselves compared to. They compare themselves to the newspaper industry. Major newspapers of the day measured their sales not in the hundreds of thousands, but in the millions. Radio and movies were just as successful, but they had both been around for some time now. If comic book companies compared themselves to another nascent medium, television, they would have been more ecstatic about their numbers. But television, that fad wasn't going anywhere. So in 1937, there were less than 2,000 television sets in the US, more in the UK, and NBC was the only network in the game with very limited programming. But because of their association with the comics section of newspapers, they either intentionally or unintentionally compared themselves to newspaper circulation. Although content did not have a big impact on comic book sales yet, the comic book industry did have a few talents in it who were poised for breakout success, most of them at National. Some of them had been there all along, and others came there from Comics Magazine after their new owners, Ultem, let them go in favor of the cheaper studio work from Chesler. Tom Hickey and Will Ely were capable and dependable artists. Major Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson of National would increasingly lean on Hickey. Leo O'Melia's work was detailed, with excellent layout work. Munson Paddock, a comic strip veteran, was adapting to the new medium and brought just enough cartoonishness to his visuals to make them dynamic. Craig Flessel's art had not stood out on features, but when he was given the time to craft the covers, his compositions were often outstanding. Joe Shuster understood layout as instinctively as Hickey and O'Melia, and while his artwork often looked crude in comparison, there was an energy in that very crudeness the others could not match. Fred Gardenier must have felt isolated as Chesler's only real talent. As he saw this big pool of capable artists coalesce around National, he may have thought about jumping ship, which he'll do later, but for now he stuck to his studio, capably turning out short Dan Hastings features, the character Chesler saw and assumed was their breakout star. Will Eisner had developed a blend of realism and cartoony, similar to Munson Paddock, yet distinctly his own. He had abandoned freelance work for Comics Magazine to co-found his own art studio, honed his craft on overseas work, and towards the end of the year emerged on the American scene, or re-emerged on it again, with the new company, Comic Favorites. What will they all accomplish in 1938? Well, spoilers, one of them is going to be drawing Superman. And for more, keep watching these episodes. And thank you for watching this one. It was short and sweet, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.